Hello and welcome to the State of Soy. I'm your host, Aaron Putze. With a winter to forget almost behind us, or at least we hope so, soybean farmers are poised to begin the 2019 growing season in earnest. You can almost sense the anticipation. Maximizing the potential of every soybean acre is important, especially this year. Managing weeds, pests, and disease and using inputs efficiently can reduce costs and boost yield potential. These are priorities for farmers. Research for farmers conducted by farmers is also a priority of the Iowa Soybean Association. In this edition of the State of Soy, we examine production issues impacting soybean farmers, the latest in soybean research, and how the Iowa Soybean Association's on-farm network can benefit your farm. Joining in the conversation are Ed Anderson. Ed serves as Iowa Soybean Association's Senior Director of Research. Ed serves as Executive Director of the North Central Soybean Research Program, and he works closely with land-grant universities, state and national soybean organizations, and industry to leverage research dollars benefiting farmers. Steve Killpack is a soybean, corn, and wheat farmer from Beebeetown in western Iowa. He's an active participant in the Iowa Soybean Association's on-farm network and a past recipient of ISA's Innovation in Production Research Award. Scott Schadler manages production system field research for John Deere's Intelligent Solutions Group. Based in Urbandale, Scott and his team consult with farmer, association, and industry clients to improve their productivity. So welcome, Ed, Steve, and Scott to this edition of the State of Soy. And let's get right to it, Ed. On-farm network. We've heard a lot about Iowa Soybean Association's on-farm network. What is it, and how is it serving farmers?
Well, the on-farm network, Aaron, does a lot, and so I'll try and be brief. But the on-farm network has been around for nearly 18 years, thanks to the vision of some really great farmers who have served on our board over the years and in years past. In a nutshell, the on-farm network, as you said, does a lot of on-farm research with farmers, on behalf of farmers, in partnership with many companies, many universities, a lot of extension work, and really tries to fill that niche where plot research at the universities is in between some of the company research that they do, and really helps farmers evaluate products and practices and new innovations on their farms.
Specifically, what are some of those things? What is the on-farm network looking at from a practical standpoint of what farmers are needing to know?
Well, the primary drive, the primary motivation of the on-farm network has always been helping farmers to be as profitable and productive and sustainable on their farms as they possibly can. So when I say they look at a lot of products and practices, those are primarily focused on cropping systems, agronomics, anything from plant populations at seeding to row spacing and the use of cover crops and different pesticides for weed control, disease and insect management, and also now increasingly biologicals for helping with plant health and crop production, and all the way to equipment and new precision ag and digital agriculture applications. So really the whole gamut.
And Steve, as the farmer on the panel, you've been very involved in the research work. You take research very seriously on your farm. You've tapped into the on-farm network. How have you done that specifically?
We started working with the on-farm network really to help identify things that we could do on our farm, as well as other practices that growers were conducting, and really being a part of something that was bigger helps to define things that you can do on your own farm to drive profitability, which is the objective. And in a challenging time, it's important to have practices that have been proven on farm.
So some of the research that you've been involved in, and we all know that this is going to be a challenging economic year. We've had some challenging economic years. This growing season is going to be as challenging, if not perhaps a bit more. So as you think about the research that you've been involved in, the kinds of topics that you've looked at on your farm, what are some things that you're going to really be looking at closely this year with an eye on input costs, with an eye on productivity and output? What's going to serve you and other farmers as we move into this growing season?
I think one of the key things, especially in soybean production, has been planting date, and that's been a change in a lot of farmers' practices, including ours, where we're actually planting soybeans before corn, trying to drive earlier planting dates, and then really the optimized seeding population that we can put out there. And so we variable rate all of our acres, really just trying to define what is the best seeding rate. It's still a work in progress, but we've found that maybe in places we were under seeding based on some generic recommendations, and so we've worked to change that. And it's all about driving the bushels at the end of the day.
So seeding rates, nitrogen applications, I know, Scott, those are all topics near and dear to your heart at John Deere. And you, over the last 3 to 4 years, have assembled a team there at John Deere to really start looking at these issues much more from a research standpoint as John Deere, and also tapping again into as well the on-farm network at Iowa Soybean. So what are some of the topics that you're looking at, that John Deere is really looking at in a way to better serve your customers and farmers?
Yep. The team that I'm involved with is called the Crop Production System Innovation Team. As you mentioned, our team has been around about 3 or 4 years. And really we're looking, so we have a team that's focused on the corn and soybean production job steps that are involved in growing a crop. And then we also have a small grains, wheat and canola. And really what we look at is a much deeper dive into the production steps of corn or soybean. And we go out and we try to look at literature, what's out there. We want to look at areas of focus that will either increase yield or decrease a farmer's input costs. And really, if there's literature out there that we're looking at of testing a hypothesis, that's really where we'll either internally test it on acres here east of Des Moines. We'll partner with partners like Iowa Soybean Association as well as universities to help us execute those field trials to establish a strong data set that'll help test out that hypothesis. And some of the areas of focus, one of them big, is nitrogen management, is one that we're really focused on here moving forward.
So as we're going into this season, there's a lot of things that farmers are thinking about. So I want to just kind of throw this open to all three of you. For farmers who are really looking at this season and saying, what kind of change could I make to maybe boost productivity, keeping an eye on output expenses or input expenses, what are some topics that really come to mind for the three of you in thinking about, again, boosting productivity, reducing costs? Ed?
Well, I think we've already touched on a few of them. So top of mind, I think, for us in the on-farm network and many of our farmers is a lot, as you said, Aaron, a lot of tillage and a lot of fertilization didn't happen last fall. Farmers are trying to decide what, if anything, I do with tillage and how do I apply my nutrients, especially nitrogen, in what form, and do I stagger that, and what are some opportunities there. Planting date, Steve mentioned. Planting date is always interesting, but planting underwater is a real challenge. So we're going to be looking at variety selections. Maybe they have to go back and change some of the orders they've made. Lots of things in the tough climate, not even considering all the economics in soybean prices that are out there too.
What do you think, Steve?
I think that one of the struggles as a producer is that you're typically looking at the bottom line, and it's a bottom line that you have yet to experience. So one of the immediate go-tos is to cut inputs, and I think that's a mistake. And we've seen that where you try to save your way to prosperity, and so we're continuing to always invest in our crop to try to drive yield and ROI, and that's really my concern, is that you see a lot of producers that are going to take this path of cutting out what we don't think is important, like fertility. And soybeans are a crop that requires a lot of fertility and a lot of management, and I think that's important.
Scott, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our standpoint is what Steve and Ed have already indicated, and how does the equipment side tie into that, and really optimizing the equipment that they have, probably moving towards some of the digital ag solutions that we have, auto track and assisted steering, and really, I guess, documenting that information in those passes, because it's going to change. They may be thinking of, here's my split between corn and soybean acres, and that may change to more soybean acres or maybe more corn. But I would say probably the bottom line is be patient, but be flexible as well. It's going to be a challenge this year.
And I think your point about, you you can't cut your way to prosperity. There are input costs. It costs money to grow a crop, and you can get to that point where maybe you try to do too much to save that you're not going to then realize an optimal crop because of that. So that brings to mind, the topic of seed treatments. And let's explore that a little bit. What are your opinions on seed treatments, and what role do they play? That's another topic that's evolved, and you'll find believers in seed where they will not plant a seed unless it's treated. You have other farmers that are not so sure. It kind of depends on maybe the year, the field, the soil type. What's your opinion on seed treatments, Steve?
I think there's always a sweet spot for anything, and it looks like the spring that we're moving into is going to be an opportunity where seed treatments are really going to pay you back, because it's going to be perhaps cooler, wetter. Those are conditions for pathogens. Those are conditions to really capitalize on that. And sudden death syndrome is going to be something that could probably really creep up later in the season, and that's an early infection. So really our only defense is seed treatment. So it's definitely something to consider, especially as we progress into spring.
Ed?
I agree with Steve on that for sure. And anytime we're looking at planting a crop earlier, especially in cool, wet conditions, we set up opportunities for pathogen and infection, especially those seedling diseases and soil-borne pathogens. That said, and I think Steve would agree, it's a real integrated approach, right? So we're looking at the genetics. Companies have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money over the years looking at these defensive traits for disease resistance, insect resistance, weed management. These all really factor in a year like this for sure. And I agree wholeheartedly, we can't skimp on our inputs. We have to really manage that crop closely. So yeah, looking at planting date, being a little patient maybe, and not tearing things up and subjecting that seed to a really bad situation, and then doing whatever we can in an integrated approach: genetics, biologicals, chemistry, seed treatments, management practices, to really try and protect that seed going in.
So I want to get your thoughts on seed treatments too, but in addition to that, from an equipment standpoint, again, with the kind of wet conditions we had during harvest, compaction, is that going to play a role in this growing season? So I'm going to throw out two questions to you. One, your opinions on seed treatments, if John Deere has looked at those, and also the issue of compaction heading into this growing season.
Yeah, I would agree with Ed and Steve in terms of the seed treatment side. I think it's going to be key to protect that seed going out. I'm sure there's going to be operators that are going to try to push the front side of the planting dates, and days like today where it's kind of sunny and maybe starting to get warmer out. They're going to do that, but we need to definitely protect that seed, and we've got one shot to put the seed in the ground per growing season. And I think some of the workload may shift, or will shift, from maybe more upspring to more in-season management of the crop. And yeah, I think compaction is definitely going to play an issue. It was in some areas a very wet fall. It was very drawn out fall harvest last year. And to Ed's point, not a lot of tillage got accomplished, not a lot of nutrients got put on last fall. So that application window and tillage window and planting window is all going to be compressed this year. And I think kind of goes back to being patient, of that it may look like it's ready, but it's probably the soil's still not ready to be fit to go across to pass in the field.
And you mentioned sudden death, and I was at a recent meeting of farmers in southeast Iowa, and that topic came up. So thoughts on sudden death. The farmer who I talked with asked, what causes it? Steve?
Yeah, it's an early season infection. And so that's why some of these seed treatments have popped up that have some level of prevention. There's no curative action. You just can kind of buffer against it. And then variety selection is another key component to it. So there's some stability that you can get. But yeah, we understand what the causal agent is, the conditions that you experience sudden death. And so if you have a field that has a history of sudden death, definitely something to pay attention to. Look at making a different investment in that seed versus maybe a field that hasn't yet experienced it. It's something that can be extremely devastating to the bottom line. Mm-hmm. You look at commodity prices today, you're looking at maybe a $10 or $12 an acre seed treatment. It could give you back big bushels.
Ed, thoughts on sudden death?
Well put, Steve. Yeah, so we do know that fusarium is one of the causal, or is the causal agent of SDS, one of the species of fusarium. These are soil-borne pathogens, diseases that impact early. As Steve said earlier in the conversation, they do infect early. We don't notice the symptoms of SDS until later in the season because there's a toxin that's produced by that fungus down below the ground that then migrates and moves systemically up into the foliar tissues. We're talking about research today, so from my perspective, the really neat thing is that the more research is done at universities and companies and by teams like ours, the more we learn about the genetics and the biological system of how this pathogen interacts with the host and what we can do from a cultural and agronomic standpoint. Seed treatments are nice. There are a number of seed treatments that are in the pipeline. A couple of them not only provide some protection against SDS, but also may help us with soybean cyst nematode and some of these other things. So again, as I said earlier, it's really an integrated approach, understanding what's being done in basic research, what we can do from an application and applied research, and then it's always, to me at least, a strong support for on-farm research, because a farmer needs to know what's my situation and what are different strategies going to do to help me on my farm.
So we always appreciate the questions we get from the field, from farmers. Here's one now.
Last year we had incidents of GALL midge in western Iowa and some surrounding states. Just was wondering what kind of research we're doing to try to control this pest and help the soybean farmers.
Question about GALL midge. We've been seeing and reading more about it, hearing more about it. Ed, give us a little background about that, about GALL midge.
Well, GALL midge is a really interesting and potentially devastating insect pest problem that's really emerged recently. Folks in Nebraska, researchers and farmers in Nebraska have first notice GALL midge in 2011. The insect is a fly as an adult. It's a maggot as an immature pest, and that's when it causes the damage. Early on in the late 2010s, or 2011, 2012, there was a lot of coincidence of these small occurrences of GALL midge with diseases, hail damage, other things. So a lot of farmers and researchers thought that GALL midge was just a secondary problem, and if you didn't have a healthy crop, if you didn't have a compromised crop, if you had a healthy crop, you wouldn't have to worry about it too much. Starting in 2017-18 growing seasons, really in several counties in states that border the Missouri River, so western Iowa is part of this, we started observing farmers, on-farm network, researchers, field agronomists, others started noticing the problem. This is a proud moment for me, representing the Iowa Soybean Association farmers and many of the other soybean boards around the region in the Midwest. We took an off cycle, so it was out of our normal budgeting cycle problem, and responded. Our farmers decided that they better get in front of this. They decided to spend some money with some researchers in the region, folks who are entomologists and field researchers, to really try and get a handle on the GALL midge and hopefully understand a little bit more about its life cycle, a little bit more about chemistry or cultural practices to control the problem, because we don't know much, and hopefully get some information into the hands of farmers for this growing season if possible, and then continue to do research and learn about it. But yeah, I think if unchecked, the GALL midge could become a real problem, and it seems to be moving around. So Steve's seen it firsthand. Maybe he can tell us some more.
And you mentioned the western Iowa piece of that. And Steve, farming in western Iowa, you've experienced it on your farm. So what should farmers be looking for in identifying this new threat to soybean yield?
Well, it's a little bit challenging to identify because it is as Ed said, it's a small fly as an adult. We don't exactly understand all of the components to its life cycle and when we're going to have specific infection. So that's a huge opportunity, why I think it's key to partner with ISA, other organizations like that, so we can develop an understanding. But when we started to hear about, that people were finding some challenges in soybean fields around, and we're always in our fields scouting We just started to inspect areas around perimeters. And in our particular fields, we saw isolated areas, but in a lot of other growers' fields, there were places where it was 100% infection rate. I mean, it was widespread across a field, and we are constantly looking at trying to control insects. So one of the practices that we do apply, we're always trying to adhere to IPM, but we want to treat with insecticides, and I think we may have just fortuitously been able to control the adults before infection. So we saw lower infection rates, but there were people that were harvesting soybeans that were in the 40 bushel range because they had either wide scale infection or pockets, and I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to this year and beyond.
So before we move on to another topic, so from a yield potential standpoint, again, what are we talking for a yield impact with GALL MIDGE? And again, just to summarize, what are some opportunities to mitigate its impact?
Well, so as Steve indicated, from a yield potential impact, it can be devastating. And unlike aphids, soybean aphids, sometimes you'll see 200 to 2,000 aphids on a plant. It doesn't take many GALL MIDGE maggots because they get internal to the stem, less than 6 inches above the soil line, and they just girdle that plant. Only a few number of maggots, probably 3 to 5 maggots, can kill a plant. So this is a real challenge. Once the eggs are laid inside the plant, chemistry control is very, very difficult. Steve's point about maybe controlling the adult flies is going to be our best approach. The answer to your question on mitigation right now is we don't know a lot, and that's why we're funding some research at Iowa State and some of these other universities around the Midwest region to really try and get a handle on how do we best manage. We don't know anything about genetic resistance. We don't know very much about cultural practices. We don't know about chemistry at this point much. From an equipment standpoint, we tend to see a little more damage and a little more severity of infestation near the borders. That may mean if we come up with some chemical controls.
Edge of field.
Edge of field, sorry, yeah. If we do come up with some chemistry control or other cultural practice, the equipment, sprayers, and the precision ag pieces that John Deere and others provide may support that. We don't know much at this time.
So really, this is the importance of the on-farm network and research. Is it's never static out there. Environment's always changing. Conditions are always changing. I mean, we had not really heard of GALL MIDGE until the last 2 or 3 years, at least in any earnest way publicly. So that's exciting from a research standpoint. There's constantly new things to have to study and to have to act on to benefit the farmer. And if we take a step back from there, Scott, we're also talking about the importance of research in scaling up to make sure that we're looking at that our field of view is wide enough and that it's also practical in terms of the kind of research that's being done. So touch on those two topics for a minute.
Yeah, from our standpoint and our team standpoint, when we look at when we look at production research, we want to make sure as much as possible, and that's why we team up and partner up with Iowa Soybean Association, is to conduct production scale research. As we're conducting the research and we see and collect a solid data set, when we're looking at it and we test out a hypothesis or either potentially bring a solution to the marketplace, that's got to be easily adaptable to your production system versus a smaller scale research. So that's really why we partner with Iowa Soybean Association. The On-Farm Network has been a great resource for us to collect a lot of data and a lot of field link strip type of research to be able to support the efforts that we're doing within our team.
So if you're a farmer out there and you're watching this and you're hearing about companies like John Deere that are involved in the on-farm network and doing some research, and Steve, of course, you've done some work with on-farm, and Ed, you help lead that program, but if you're a farmer, you're hearing that and you have not been involved with the on-farm network, Steve, how easy is it to get involved with the on-farm network and be part of that network of farmers that are working collaboratively and collectively? And then, Ed, I want to go to you about how what you would say to encourage farmers to get involved in the role they can play. So first, Steve, from your standpoint, you've been involved. How have you been involved, and how easy was it?
The process was very easy for me. I had some relationships with director and some collaboration that we had done prior to. I was an agronomist before I became a full-time farmer, so that was something that I felt was very, very important. So just making the connection and the relationships and the networking, it's all very easy. It's just a choice. And if you make the decision to want to improve your farm, that's just one piece that can dramatically change what you're doing.
So how can farmers start? Where can farmers go to begin that, Ed? And what's in it for them when they do?
Well, very good. And Steve, great plug. Thank you. So we try and touch farmers across the state in many different ways. Champions and participants like Steve, and company partners like Scott, and many companies. You know, the On-Farm Network has worked hard over the years to really develop this reputation for credibility and unbiased research. And you know, we don't promote and we don't trash anybody. We just present the data, and we work with as many companies and university folks and farmers and others as we possibly can. Of course, we have a team of regional agronomists. These are talented guys that are out in the field all the time. Within the Iowa Soybean Association, we have our producer services team, members of your team, Aaron, and communications. You know, ISA is out in the countryside all the time, and we're always there to support each other and promote interactions with other members of the association. So there's a lot of ways to develop those personal relationships that Steve talks about, the networking opportunities. If you're a person that likes social media, we're on social media. If you like going to websites, we certainly have the iasoybeans.com website. Research has a prominent place on that website and tells you all the different trials that you can participate in, all the plans for this season, all the historical research data that we have, and how to make contact with us. So lots of ways we try and establish this engagement by as many farmers and others across the state as we possibly can.
And I know that the Iowa Soybean Research Center at Iowa State University, quickly at a little bit of background talking about collaborations and working together. Share a little bit about the center and how the role that it's playing in benefiting soybean farmers.
I'll try and do my best to be short because it's got a nice long history. The center, the Iowa Soybean Research Center at Iowa State, was approved by the Board of Regents in the summer of 2014. It was conceived and talked about long before that, and it really got its feet in 2014. Dr. Greg Tilka is the director of that center. He's a nematologist and a plant pathologist at Iowa State. He does a great job. We have a great partnership with him across all of the Iowa Soybean Association research teams, certainly the On-Farm Network. Really, what we always try and say is that research is a big space. And there's opportunities for everybody to contribute to research that will benefit farmers and the soybean industry. We all have a role to play. We all have a place to be. So the Soybean Center is really primarily focused on trying to build more public-private partnerships across the farmer, all of our soybean farmers across the state, across the Soybean Association, the university, a number of companies, to really try and seek ways to fill a niche where specific research can benefit the soybean industry and ultimately the farmers we serve.
Another topic, another pest that we all probably recall, take the test, beat the pest. Remember that one? You know, the 1990s is calling and they want that tagline back. But that's really when that started ramping up, the soybean cyst nematode in the 90s. But we have not eradicated that pest.
No.
I've been told that there's two kinds of farmers, those who have SCN and those who do but don't admit it. Or know it.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about that. Steve, SCN, why does it matter? What has been your experience? How are you acting on that to keep those populations under control?
So soybean cyst nematode was a problem that really kind of popped up in our part of the world, and we've got some soil conditions that are conducive for SCN, and so we pay attention to what the resistance and also the rotation of that resistance, because we're trying to do our due diligence to ensure that we have the technologies and the protection of for SCN, and then also looking at different seed treatments that can offer up some protection. But everything that we do, we look at it from a profitability standpoint. So we start there, and then that lends itself to the agronomic condition. Oftentimes we're reverse of that. We look at agronomics and profitability as secondary. If I have a piece of ground that is not very productive, I'm looking at ways that I can either increase productivity, reduce input costs, or do both, and that's really the win-win. So SCN is definitely going to be at the top of the list to always pay attention to. Again, we haven't eradicated it. We're not going to. So it's something that we are definitely paying attention to every year.
Have you looked at that topic as well, Scott?
We really haven't yet, but we know it's on farmers' top of mind. What we're doing is trying to educate ourselves as best we can. I mean, with the great information that comes out of Iowa State and ISA is what's the equipment play in it, if there is. But yeah, it's not going away, and I think the education, the due diligence, and being on the proactive side, I think will help to minimize it as we move forward.
You know, Steve touched on a couple of things. Anything to add to that, Ed, from just from a management standpoint on SCN?
Just real quickly, yeah, because well done. And as you said, Aaron, the first coalition in the 90s was all about raising awareness and helping farmers with management solutions that existed at that time. Oddly enough, the primary management solution then is the same one we have now, the genetic resistance and the derivation from that. You hear people talk about this plant introduction, PI 88788. The RHG genes for resistance are derived from that source and still predominantly used. Nature finds a way, and populations of nematodes are overcoming that resistance. So managing with different options from seed companies on different sources of resistance. We're also trying to again raise awareness with the new coalition, and at the same time promote the basic research that has led to some really cool discoveries. So rather than being too fearful that 88788 source of resistance is failing completely and going away, what our basic research has discovered is that that's not a single gene, that's multiple copies of that gene, and the more copies of that gene that you have in a variety, the better resistance you're going to have. So we're just trying to help manage and extend the life of all these resistant options. There are a few seed treatments now available. We talked about seed treatments. Certainly management practices, rotations, these kinds of things, all working together can help us with this pest. And just to put some numbers on it, SCN is still over a $1 billion a year problem in North America. So it's a big deal.
It's for real, and as one farmer told me, he said, what's the impact of SCN? Well, look at it this way. If you're losing 8 to 10 to 12 bushel an acre, over 10 years you've lost a soybean crop.
That's right.
So that's the impact. So as we prepared to close out this conversation, I just wanted to get some quick hits from you, some answers, and we'll move through this rather quickly. When you think about 2019, what do you think will be the #1 pest or disease topic that comes forth during this growing season that we're going to be talking about? Steve?
Well, I remember, we got done talking about soybean gall midge, and I remember when Asian soybean rust was going to be the big disease, and we spent a lot of time focused on that, trying to understand that. That never really came to fruition in this part of the world, and I think being cognizant of what we just discussed, SCN, SDS, those are the big problems, and don't forget about them, and I think that's going to be still the problem. I mean, year over year, those are the big players, and we need to pay attention to that, and that'll be our focus in 2019.
Scott?
Yeah, I'd say the same from a disease standpoint, and it's probably taken a much broader approach. If we're maybe focused on a couple specific diseases, another one over here will pop up, and overall it's going to be a challenge just based on what we're seeing sitting here today. We did in some areas have a pretty large infestation of Japanese beetle and aphids last year. Where are those going to show up? Again, I think it's the bottom line, no matter what the pest or disease is, it's being out in your fields regularly like Steve does and being very proactive in scouting to try to be on the front side of it.
Ed?
Well put. I totally agree. The only piece I would add is, we talked earlier about the potentially cool, wet spring. That seed going into the ground needs to be protected against seedling diseases and soil-borne pathogens, and so that's a group I would add to this. But yeah, totally agree with these guys.
So in thinking about our crop that hasn't been planted yet, but as we look at the growing season, and we know we're going to start with ample moisture, that's not going to be a problem. We've filled the tank from a moisture standpoint. Do you expect 2019 that we will surpass the 565 million bushel production total that we achieved in 2018, or are we going to come in under that? What's your guess? I'm going to start with that easy question with Scott. What's your prediction?
I would say if the soybean crop is managed, if there's more time spent on the soybean crop, I think we can surpass it with continued improved genetics that are introduced to the marketplace year over year. And the in-season nutrient management, I think, is going to be key. I think we have a good opportunity to surpass that level from next year. Mother Nature will help us determine.
Has a lot to say about it. Ed, your prediction?
Well put. I think, the answer I would give is it depends, right? We've got good moisture right now. Farmers making good choices on planting and protection and management, and then August rains are always a nice thing. So how many acres are going to go in, and what's the weather going to be like?
It's a guess at this point, isn't it? Steve, what's your prediction?
I think with the acre battle that is potentially on the horizon here, it could be tough to surpass it, but if we make sure we make the right investments in the crop and protect it and do those things, it's all going to depend on the volume of acres that we've got out there to get to the number.
Yep. So lastly, what research work being done gives you the most optimism about the impact it can have for soybean farmers in a positive way? So, Ed?
I'm really jazzed about the tillage practices and the cultural practices and all the agronomics research that we're doing on farm to really help kick things up in terms of yield potential.
Very good. Scott?
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think the big key takeaway is no matter if you're a farmer or an association or an equipment manufacturer, we're all kind of looking at the same thing, and really the two main goals, either increase yield or decrease inputs. And I would agree with that. The cultural practices, I think the timing of some of these practices in season, preseason, all of that, I would say from a John Deere perspective, we're poised to provide the solutions depending on when a customer needs to get in the field and make certain applications throughout the growing season.
Steve, you get the final say.
Wow. This is my moment. I think a lot about that bag of seed that I buy, and that every soybean seed that is in that bag costs me the same. And it's always astonished me that a soybean plant is aborting 80% of its flowers, and I'm not retaining those pods. So my goal is always to understand why that is happening. And we have this experience across a field as we look at our yield monitor data where we see variability in yield. And I want to ensure that I get an ROI on every seed that I put out there. And so really this agronomic management piece, that is the key. And just think of what the potential of a soybean plant is, what the potential of your crop could be, and don't lose sight of that. And that to me is what makes all of this so important, is that management piece does potentially a lot more than all the others.
Well, there's a lot to discuss. We'll have to leave it there. I think we'll be revisiting this topic and the research topic in earnest again very soon. So with that, we'll need to leave our conversation there. I want to thank our panelists, Ed Anderson, Steve Killpack, and also Scott Schadler. Also to the Machine Shed Restaurant here in Urbandale for hosting this timely and informative conversation. For more information about the production research issues we've discussed, go to iasoybeans.com and be sure to click on the ISA Research tab when you do. You can also find the Iowa Soybean Association and our research work being promoted and discussed on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. The State of Soy also welcomes your feedback and ideas for topics to feature on future programs. You can send them my way at aputze@iasoybeans.com. Your input is valued and always appreciated. In our next edition of the State of Soy, we'll examine the wild world of food labels and branding and how the marketing claims and choices made at the supermarket directly impacts you as a farmer. Until then, the very best to you from the Iowa Soybean Association. Now go make it a great day.
This edition of the State of Soy sponsored in part by Bayer Crop Science. Bayer Crop Science, science for a better life.